Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into one of the most complex, dramatic, and frankly infamous economic collapses of the 21st century. We're talking about the Greek debt crisis. We are going to look at exactly how a seemingly stable, modern European economy suddenly found itself teetering on the absolute brink of total financial ruin, a crisis that ended up sending shockwaves across the entire globe.
To make sense of this massive domino effect, we're going to break the whole narrative down into 5 distinct, easy-to-digest chapters: the seeds of crisis, cooking the books, the bailouts and austerity, the human cost, and finally, we'll wrap up with recovery and aftermath.
All right, let's just jump right in with Chapter 1, The Seeds of Crisis. To really understand what went wrong, we have to rewind a bit. Before the year 2001, Greece had its own currency, and frankly, a pretty rocky history of debt. Lenders knew this, right? So they naturally charged Greece higher interest rates just to offset the risk of lending to them. But then everything changed in 2001 when Greece adopted the euro. Trade costs dropped, which was great, but more importantly, joining the Eurozone essentially handed Greece a shiny new, extremely high-limit credit card. Suddenly, the global financial markets were treating Greece as if it were as safe a bet as Germany. And the result? A massive, unprecedented surge in government borrowing, simply because credit was suddenly incredibly cheap and abundant.
But here's the catch, and it's a big one. There was a fatal disconnect happening behind the scenes. Money was pouring out, but it just wasn't coming in. Compared to its European neighbors, Greece had this massive shadow or underground economy. We're talking 21.5% of its entire GDP. That means over a fifth of the economy was operating completely under the radar. So billions of euros that absolutely should have been collected in taxes simply vanished into thin air, leaving this gaping, massive hole in the national budget.
Which brings us to the moment it all started to unravel. Chapter 2, Cooking the Books.
Fast forward to late 2009. A newly elected Greek government opens up the ledger and realizes, wow, the books are completely cooked. It was bad. Eurostat, which is the European Statistics Agency, released this blistering, very public statement. They called out a severe lack of quality in the data, essentially revealing that the previous government had been deliberately misreporting its deficits just to bypass strict Eurozone rules.
And the sheer scale of this deception? Absolutely staggering. Initial official forecasts for the 2009 deficit were sitting at around a manageable 6 to 8%, but the final revised reality? 15.4% of GDP. That single, massive number caused absolute panic across the continent. Private capital markets literally froze overnight. Investors suddenly realized they had zero idea what they were actually buying, and borrowing costs for Greece skyrocketed instantly.
Now, you might be wondering, how do you even hide that much debt from the world? Well, the answer lies in something called off-market swaps. Think of these as complex financial smoke and mirrors. Basically, major banks, like Goldman Sachs, actually helped arrange deals to convert Greek debts into other currencies at entirely fictitious exchange rates. This clever trick effectively hid billions of euros in liabilities, masking the true debt levels so Greece could keep circumventing European Union reporting rules.
So, the secret is out, and the money is gone. Let's move to Chapter 3, the bailouts and austerity.
Enter the Troika. When Greece lost its access to private financial markets, they were literally days away from a complete sovereign default. They desperately needed a rescue, and that rescue came in the form of a tripartite committee made up of the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. These massive key players stepped in to offer unprecedented rescue funds. But as you can guess, this wasn't free money. Not at all. It came in exchange for incredibly strict austerity measures. We're talking deep, painful spending cuts, massive tax hikes, and sweeping structural reforms.
Let's walk through this timeline of survival because it is a chaotic ride. In 2010, the first bailout drops, providing 110 billion euros. But as the recession just kept worsening, it simply wasn't enough. By 2012, they needed a second bailout of 130 billion euros alongside a historic 50% haircut. Basically, private investors were forced to take massive losses on their Greek bonds. Still, the crisis dragged on. In June 2015, Greece actually became the first developed country ever to default on an IMF loan payment. They totally missed the deadline before a third and final massive bailout was finally agreed upon later that year.
Now, as the primary financier of all these bailouts, Germany's role became intensely polarizing. And it's important we look at both sides of this debate. On one side, Germany was widely viewed as the prudent lender. They were demanding necessary responsibility and strict fiscal discipline to fix a system that was fundamentally broken. But on the other side, critics argued Germany was a hypocritical enabler. They pointed out that German banks irresponsibly lent billions to Greece in the first place, and argued Germany was ultimately using the crisis to pursue its own national self-interest and export dominance by forcing crushing deflation on southern Europe.
But we really need to step away from the macroeconomic spreadsheets for a second. Chapter 4, the human cost.
25%. Between 2009 and 2014, a quarter of Greece's entire economic output was just wiped out. Gone. To put that into perspective for you, this was the longest and deepest recession of any advanced mixed economy in modern history.
The job market practically collapsed overnight. By May 2012, youth unemployment peaked at an absolutely unprecedented 54.9%. More than half of all young people out there looking for work were just met with closed doors. And if you look at the broader population, a full quarter of the entire workforce was sidelined.
The sheer devastation spread to literally every corner of society. By 2012, 20,000 Greeks were newly homeless. By 2016, 1 in 3 citizens were living in poverty. The despair was so profound that suicidality spiked by 36% in just the early years of the crisis. And with 111,000 companies going bankrupt in 2000 alone, hundreds of thousands of Greece's brightest minds just packed their bags and left, creating this massive brain drain just so they could survive.
All of this intense suffering inevitably pushed the public to a political boiling point. In July 2015, the nation held a highly dramatic referendum, asking the public to basically accept or reject the Troika's latest harsh bailout terms. A resounding 61% majority voted no. This massive act of defiance sent global markets tumbling and brought Greece to the absolute brink of a Grexit, meaning an exit from the Eurozone entirely. Now, the government ultimately had to cave and accept a deal anyway to prevent total systemic collapse. But that vote, it proved just how broken and exhausted the populace really was.
Which brings us to our final chapter, Chapter 5, Recovery and Aftermath.
Recovery required some really tangible, structural steps to finally fix the root issues. Remember that rampant tax evasion we talked about earlier? Well, Greece mandated electronic point-of-sale devices for hundreds of thousands of businesses to force a permanent paper trail and curb VAT fraud. Fiscally, they slowly righted the ship. They officially exited their final bailout program in August 2018. Remarkably, they even repaid all their IMF loans 2 full years ahead of schedule in 2022. And by 2025, they actually began regaining their classification as a developed market.
To really understand this turnaround, you have to look at borrowing costs, which are pretty much the ultimate measure of market confidence. By 2019, Greece's 10-year government bond yields actually dropped below Italy's. And then, incredibly, in 2024, they fell below France's. The financial markets, which once viewed Greece as entirely toxic, now view it as a safer bet than some of the absolute largest economies in Europe. It is, for sure, a remarkable market recovery.
Which leaves us with this final incredibly vital question as we wrap up. As Greece's economy undeniably bounces back, we really have to look at the legacy of these bailouts. Was a decade of crushing austerity, with all of its deep human suffering, the necessary and only way to save the nation? Or, as some economists argue today, was forcing deflation during a massive recession a catastrophic macroeconomic mistake that made the crisis far, far worse than it ever needed to be? It's a debate that is absolutely going to shape economic policy for generations to come. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this helped untangle the timeline for you.